Wilhelm Krauss watched through the narrow gunport as the blizzard tried to kill his neighbor. The wind had torn Marcus Teller's cabin door off its hinges 3 hours earlier, and now the snow was pouring inside, burying everything Marcus owned. What happened in the 8 months after Wilhelm pulled Marcus half-frozen from that ruined cabin would change how mountain men built their doors across the entire northern Rockies. The technique Wilhelm developed would save dozens of lives over the next 2 decades, but the story begins not with innovation, but with the storm that showed him exactly what frontier construction could not survive. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The blizzard of January 1841 hit the northern Rocky Mountains with a ferocity that even veteran trappers had rarely seen. Wilhelm Krauss had experienced 8 winters in these mountains since leaving Hamburg and the shipyards where he had learned his trade. But this storm was different. The wind didn't gust and fade like normal winter weather. It howled with sustained force, hour after hour, pushing against every structure with relentless pressure. Inside his small cabin near the Yellowstone River tributaries, Wilhelm kept his fire burning and waited for the storm to pass. He had reinforced his door that autumn with extra crossbeams, thinking himself prepared. But as the wind screamed outside and his cabin walls groaned under the assault, he realized his preparations were barely adequate. Around midday on the second day of the storm, Wilhelm noticed something through the narrow gunport he had cut into his wall for defense against potential threats. The gunport was just a slit, 4 inches wide and 12 inches tall, angled to allow rifle fire while remaining nearly invisible from outside. Through this opening, Wilhelm could see his neighbor's cabin 200 yards away across the small clearing they shared. Marcus Teller had built that cabin the previous spring using the same methods every trapper used. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with mud and moss, a single door made from split planks held together with cross pieces and hung on iron hinges. It had taken Marcus 5 days to build. It was adequate shelter, or so everyone believed. Wilhelm watched as Marcus's door began to fail. The wind pressure pushed against it with such force that the door bowed inward visibly, even from 200 yards away. Marcus had barred it from inside with a heavy wooden beam, but the bar could only resist direct pressure. It couldn't stop the door from flexing. The hinges, mounted with square nails driven into the doorframe logs, were tearing free under the sustained load. Wilhelm could see the door moving, shifting, the gap between door and frame widening with each powerful gust. Then the top hinge failed completely, the 8th door, still attached at the bottom hinge and held by the interior bar, twisted violently. The bar snapped. The door swung inward and then was ripped completely off its remaining hinge by the wind. It disappeared into the white chaos of blowing snow. Immediately, the blizzard began pouring into Marcus's cabin. Snow driven by 50-mile-per-hour winds filled the opening in seconds. Wilhelm grabbed his heavy coat and rope, knowing what he had to do. Wilhelm fought his way across the 200 yards, separating the cabins with a rope tied around his waist and anchored to his doorframe. Without that rope, he would have been lost in the whiteout conditions within minutes. The wind tried to knock him down with every step. Snow stung his face like thrown sand. By the time he reached Marcus's cabin, snow had already filled the doorway to a depth of 3 feet, and more was pouring in with every passing second. Wilhelm could hear Marcus shouting from inside, but the words were lost in the wind's roar. Wilhelm began digging with his hands, throwing snow aside as fast as he could, but the wind replaced it almost immediately. He shifted strategy and pushed his way through the drift into the cabin interior. Inside was chaos. The fireplace had been extinguished by the invading snow. Everything Marcus owned was being buried. The interior temperature, which should have been warm from the fire, was already dropping toward the outside temperature of 20 degrees below zero. Marcus was at the back of the cabin, trying desperately to salvage his supplies, but it was hopeless. The blizzard owned this space now. Wilhelm grabbed Marcus by the arm and shouted directly into his ear. They had to leave immediately. Marcus resisted for a moment, looking at his supplies, his furs, his equipment, but Wilhelm pulled harder. Marcus finally understood and followed. They crawled through the snow-filled doorway and into the full force of the storm. Wilhelm's rope guided them back across the fine clearing. The journey took nearly 20 minutes. Both men were exhausted and half-frozen when they finally pushed through Wilhelm's door and collapsed inside. Wilhelm's cabin was still intact, but barely. His door had held, but he could feel it flexing under the wind pressure. The crossbeams he had added were groaning. The hinges were solid for now, but he wondered how much longer they would last. Marcus sat by the fire, shaking from cold and shock, staring at nothing. He had lost everything except his life. His furs, representing a season's work, were buried. His food supplies were ruined. His tools and traps were gone. His shelter no longer existed. The storm continued for another day and a half. During that time, Wilhelm studied his own door constantly. He watched how it flexed inward during the strongest gusts. He felt the frame shifting slightly as pressure built and released. He examined the hinges, seeing how the nails holding them were working loose incrementally with each cycle of stress. His door was holding, but not because it was well designed. It was holding because he had gotten lucky with the wood selection and the storm had not quite exceeded the failure threshold. Another few hours of this wind, or wind from a slightly different angle, and his door would fail exactly as Marcus's had failed. Wilhelm realized something during those long hours of observation. The standard way of building cabin doors was fundamentally flawed. Every trapper built them the same way because that was how everyone had always built them. But everyone was wrong. The doors were fighting the wind with rigid resistance, and rigid materials under sustained stress eventually failed. There had to be a better approach, but Wilhelm did not yet know what it was. When the storm finally ended on the fourth day, Wilhelm and Marcus emerged to find a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to heights of 8 and 10 feet in places. The clearing between their cabins was unrecognizable. Marcus's cabin stood like a broken tooth, its doorway a gaping wound packed solid with snow. The door itself was nowhere to be seen, probably buried under a drift or blown a quarter-mile away into the forest. Wilhelm helped Marcus dig out what supplies could be salvaged. Most of the furs were ruined by moisture. The food stores were scattered and frozen into solid blocks mixed with snow. It took 2 days of hard work to recover anything useful. But Wilhelm's mind was not on salvage work. He was thinking about doors. He could not stop thinking about doors. That night, while Marcus slept exhausted by the fire, Wilhelm lay awake analyzing what he had witnessed. The failure sequence played repeatedly in his mind. Wind pressure, door flexing, hinges tearing loose, bar snapping, total collapse. It had happened in stages, each weakness leading to the next failure. The door had not been destroyed by a single catastrophic force. It had been destroyed by sustained pressure, exploiting multiple weak points in sequence. Over the next 3 weeks, as winter continued and travel became possible again, Wilhelm visited every trapper camp within a day's travel. He told people he was checking on their welfare after the storm, which was partly true, but his real purpose was studying cabin doors. He found that the January blizzard had destroyed or damaged doors at 7 different locations. 3 cabins had lost their doors completely, like Marcus's. 4 others had suffered serious damage with broken bars, torn hinges, or split door planks. Only 2 cabins besides Wilhelm's had survived, with doors intact, and in both cases the trappers admitted their doors had been on the verge of failure. Wilhelm examined every damaged door carefully. He measured hinge placement, studied how bars had been mounted, looked at wood grain and broken planks, and traced the failure patterns. A clear picture emerged. Standard cabin doors failed in predictable ways. The hinges were always the first weak point. They were mounted to the surface of the door frame with nails or screws, which meant the only thing holding them in place was the grip of those fasteners in the wood. Under sustained wind pressure that pushed the door inward, the hinges acted as lever points. The force was multiplied, and the fasteners worked loose or tore out completely. The bars were the second weak point. Most trappers used a simple wooden beam that dropped into iron or wooden brackets mounted on either side of the door. The bar was strong in compression, preventing the door from being pushed straight inward, but it could not prevent the door from flexing or bowing. Under sustained pressure, the door planks would bend, the bar would bind in its brackets, and eventually something would break. Either the bar itself would snap, or the brackets would tear free, or the door planks would split along their length. The door construction itself was the third weak point. Standard doors were made from planks held together with crosspieces nailed or pegged on the interior face. This created a panel that was strong enough for normal use but had no structural rigidity under lateral stress. When wind pushed from one side, the planks could shift relative to each other. The nails or pegs holding the crosspieces would work loose. Gaps would open between planks. Even if the hinges and bar held, the door itself could come apart. Wilhelm talked to the trappers who had survived door failures. Their stories were remarkably consistent. The doors had held for hours, flexing and groaning but staying in place. Then, something would give way, usually a hinge, and once one element failed, the rest followed quickly. The trappers described the terrifying moment when their shelter suddenly became penetrable, when the blizzard that had been kept outside came roaring in with unstoppable force. Wilhelm spent the rest of February thinking about a problem that most trappers accepted as unsolvable. Doors were weak, because they had to be light enough to open easily while strong enough to resist wind pressure. These requirements seemed contradictory. Make a door too heavy and thick, and it became impractical for daily use. Keep it light and manageable, and it couldn't survive extreme weather. Every trapper Wilhelm talked to shrugged and accepted this trade-off as inevitable. But Wilhelm could not accept it. His background kept pulling him toward a different way of thinking. Before coming to America at age 23, Wilhelm had worked for 6 years in the Hamburg shipyards on the Elbe River. He had started as a general laborer, hauling timber and cleaning work areas, but he had watched everything the skilled craftsmen did. He learned how ships were built, how their components functioned, how forces were managed and redirected. By the time he left Hamburg, he was working as an assistant to the ship's carpenters, helping build and repair the smaller vessels that worked the river trade. One memory kept returning to him during those February nights. He remembered working on a river barge that carried bulk cargo between Hamburg and ports downstream. The barge had cargo holds with large doors that needed to remain sealed even when the vessel was moving through rough water. These doors were massive, each one weighing several hundred pounds, but they could be opened and closed by a single man using a system of ropes and pulleys. More importantly, the doors stayed sealed against their frames even when waves struck the hull, because they were held in place not by rigid bars, but by constant tension from counterweights. Wilhelm had not thought about that barge in years, but now the memory was vivid. He could see the door system clearly in his mind. Heavy hemp ropes ran from the top of each door up to wooden pulley blocks mounted on the overhead deck beams. The ropes passed through the pulleys and down to counterweights made of scrap iron. When the door was closed, the counterweight pulled the rope, which pulled the top of the door inward against the frame. The weight didn't fight the door. It helped seal the door. If you wanted to open the door, you simply lifted the counterweight slightly, releasing the tension, and the door would swing freely. The genius of the system was that it provided constant pressure without rigid resistance. A bar across a door was either locked or unlocked, strong or broken, but a rope under tension from a counterweight was flexible. It absorbed impacts and pressure variations. It adjusted automatically to keep the door sealed, regardless of external forces. The harder the wind pushed the door outward, the more the counterweight pulled it inward. The two forces balanced each other. Wilhelm sat up suddenly, startling Marcus awake. He had just realized something crucial. A cabin door was not fundamentally different from a cargo hold door. Both needed to seal against external pressure. Both needed to open when required. The same principles that worked on a Hamburg river barge could work on a mountain cabin. He just needed to adapt the system to frontier materials and conditions. When spring arrived in late March of 1841, Wilhelm prepared to leave the mountains for St. Louis. Most trappers made this journey annually to sell their furs and purchase supplies for the next season. Wilhelm had a decent collection of beaver pelts from the winter's work, enough to bring fair money at the fur trading posts. But his mind was not focused on profit. He was planning to use this trip for a different purpose entirely. Marcus Teller had decided to stay in the mountains that spring. He had lost too much in the blizzard and needed to trap aggressively through the spring season to make up his losses. Wilhelm helped Marcus build a temporary shelter with a reinforced door before he left, using extra crossbeams and heavier hinges than standard construction. It was better than what Marcus had before, but Wilhelm knew it still was not good enough. The door would hold against normal weather, but would likely fail again if another extreme blizzard struck. The journey to Street. Louis took 3 weeks on horseback, following the established trapper routes east through the mountain passes and down to the Missouri River Valley. Wilhelm traveled with a group of 5 other trappers, which provided safety from potential hostile encounters and shared labor in setting up camps each night. The other men talked about whiskey and women, and which trading houses paid the best prices for prime pelts. Wilhelm listened politely, but contributed little to these conversations. His thoughts were occupied with pulleys and ropes and counterweights. When they reached Street Louis in mid-April, the other trappers headed immediately to the taverns and brothels that lined the riverfront streets. Wilhelm went to the commercial district where ships docked and trading warehouses stood along the Mississippi River. He spent 3 full days walking the docks, watching cargo operations, studying how longshoremen moved heavy loads using block and tackle systems. He saw compound pulley arrangements that allowed 2 men to lift loads that would require a dozen men without mechanical advantage. He watched carefully how the ropes were threaded through multiple pulley blocks, how the blocks were mounted to overhead beams, how the systems were anchored. On the 4th day, Wilhelm approached a ship's carpenter working on repairs to a medium-sized cargo vessel. The man was German, from Bremen, and willing to talk to a fellow countryman. Wilhelm explained that he needed to understand pulley systems for a construction project in the mountains. The carpenter assumed Wilhelm was planning to build some kind of hoist for moving logs or supplies, which was close enough to the truth that Wilhelm did not correct him. The carpenter spent 2 hours explaining the principles. Single pulleys changed direction of force, but provided no mechanical advantage. Each additional pulley in a compound system multiplied the force. A 2-pulley system gave you 2-to-1 advantage. 3 pulleys gave 4-to-1. The quality of the pulleys mattered greatly. They needed smooth grooves for the rope, well-fitted axle pins, and hard wood that would not wear quickly under friction. Oak or hickory were best. The rope needed to be thick enough to handle the load without stretching or fraying. Wilhelm spent 6 days in Street Louis, acquiring supplies that made other trappers shake their heads in confusion. While his companions purchased the standard goods, gunpowder, lead for bullets, coffee, salt, tobacco, and replacement traps, Wilhelm bought items that seemed to have no purpose in the wilderness. He purchased 60 feet of heavy hemp rope, the type used on river vessels, at a cost of $2, which was expensive for something that could not trap beaver or kill game. He bought 4 iron axle pins, each 10 inches long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter, machined smooth by a blacksmith. He purchased a specialized draw knife for shaping wood and a set of wood chisels with different blade widths. The most unusual purchase was a quantity of beeswax and rendered animal fat, which Wilhelm planned to mix as lubricant for moving parts. When the other trappers saw his supplies packed on his horse, they openly mocked him. One man joked that Wilhelm was planning to open a carpentry shop in the mountains. Another suggested he had forgotten he was a trapper and not a shipbuilder. Wilhelm smiled and said nothing. Let them think what they wanted. He knew exactly what he was doing. Before leaving Street Louis, Wilhelm made one final visit to the riverfront. He found the German carpenter again and asked specific questions about carving pulley wheels from solid wood. The carpenter explained the process in detail. You needed a hardwood round, either cut as a cross-section from a tree trunk or hewn from a larger piece of timber. The round should be 12 to 14 inches in diameter and 2 inches thick for a medium-load pulley. You carved the groove around the circumference using a gouge and draw knife, making it deep enough to hold the rope securely, but smooth enough that the rope could move freely. The center hole for the axle pin had to be perfectly centered and drilled carefully to avoid splitting the wood. The carpenter warned Wilhelm that carving good pulleys took time and patience. A skilled craftsman could make one in 2 days. An inexperienced worker might take a week per pulley and still end up with something that would not spin smoothly. Wilhelm asked if there was a trick to getting the center hole perfectly aligned. The carpenter showed him a technique using crossed strings to find the exact center point before drilling. He also explained how to test the balance by spinning the finished pulley on a temporary axle. If it wobbled or had a heavy side, it needed more shaping. Wilhelm thanked the carpenter and paid him a silver dollar for his time and expertise, which surprised and pleased the man. Knowledge had value, and Wilhelm was willing to pay for it. He left St. Louis in early May with his unusual supplies and a clear understanding of what he needed to build. The journey back to the mountains took 3 weeks. During those long days of travel, Wilhelm refined his design in his mind, working through every detail of how the system would function. Wilhelm returned to the mountains in late May of 1841 to find Marcus Teller still alive and working his trapline successfully. The temporary door Wilhelm had helped build before leaving was holding adequately, though Marcus admitted it flexed badly during windstorms, and he worried constantly about another blizzard. Wilhelm assured him that by next winter, both of them would have doors that could withstand anything the mountains offered. Marcus was skeptical but willing to watch what Wilhelm planned to do. Wilhelm spent the first week back scouting for specific trees. He needed hardwood for the pulley discs, and hardwood was not abundant in this region, dominated by pine and spruce. He ranged several miles from his cabin, following creek valleys where deciduous trees grew in scattered groves. He found what he needed on the third day, a stand of oak trees growing on a south-facing slope near a spring. The trees were not large by Eastern standards, but several were suitable for his purpose. He selected 2 oak trees, each approximately 14 inches in diameter at chest height, straight-grained and showing no signs of rot or disease. He felled them carefully using his axe, a process that took most of a day for both trees. He cut cross-sections from each trunk, creating wooden rounds 16 inches in diameter and 3 inches thick. These rounds were green wood, heavy with moisture, but Wilhelm knew they would dry and harden over time. He needed them oversized now because he would carve away significant material during shaping. Hauling the oak rounds back to his cabin required 2 full days of hard work. Each round weighed approximately 60 pounds, awkward to carry and impossible to roll over rough mountain terrain. Wilhelm fashioned a travois from pine poles and dragged the rounds behind him, resting frequently. When he finally got them back to his cabin, he was exhausted but satisfied. He had the raw material for his pulleys. The carving process began immediately. Wilhelm set up a work area outside his cabin where light was good, and he had room to move around the large wooden rounds. He started with the first disc, using the string technique, the street. Louis Carpenter had taught him to find the exact center point. He marked the center carefully with charcoal, then drilled a pilot hole using a hand auger. The hole needed to be 3/4 of an inch in diameter to fit his iron axle pins, perfectly centered and drilled perpendicular to the disc face. This was more difficult than it sounded. The wood wanted to split, the bit wanted to wander offline. Wilhelm worked slowly, checking alignment constantly, enlarging the hole gradually with different-sized bits. After 2 days of careful work, he had the center hole completed in the first disc. Now came the shaping. Using his draw knife and gouges, Wilhelm began carving the groove around the disc's circumference. The groove needed to be 1/2 an inch deep and rounded to cradle the rope without pinching it. He worked in careful passes, removing thin layers of wood, checking the curve constantly against a template he had carved from scrap pine. The first pulley disc took Wilhelm 9 days to complete. The second took 7 days because he had learned from his mistakes. Each disc was now a smooth wheel, with a perfect groove carved around its circumference and a precisely centered hole for the axle pin. Wilhelm tested each disc by mounting it temporarily on a wooden rod and spinning at it. Both spun smoothly with minimal wobble. He applied his mixture of beeswax and animal fat to the center holes, working the lubricant into the wood grain. The discs were ready for installation. The door itself required another 2 weeks of focused work. Wilhelm selected the straightest pine logs he could find and split them into planks using wedges and a maul. Each plank was 3 inches thick, a foot wide, and 7 feet long. He shaped them with his draw knife until they were uniform in thickness and smooth on both sides. He cut tongue and groove joints along the edges so the planks would interlock rather than simply butting against each other. This was tedious work that required precision, but Wilhelm knew the joints would create a door that functioned as a single solid piece rather than separate planks that could shift. He assembled 5 planks into a door that was 5 feet wide and 7 feet tall. The door weighed approximately 90 pounds, which concerned Wilhelm initially, but he reminded himself that the pulley system would make the weight manageable. He reinforced the interior face with diagonal iron brackets, bolting them through the door planks and clinching the bolts over on the exterior side. The door was rigid, strong, and heavy. The hinges were massive compared to standard cabin hardware. Wilhelm had purchased them in St. Louis specifically for this project. Each hinge was iron, 14 inches long, with thick mounting plates. But Wilhelm did not mount them the way most people mounted hinges. Instead of simply screwing or nailing them to the door frame, he carved mortises into both the door edge and the frame log. The hinges sat inside these carved pockets, distributing their load across a much larger area of wood. He secured them with iron pins driven through the logs themselves. To remove these hinges, someone would have to destroy the logs. The door frame required equal attention. Wilhelm cut precise notches in the logs on either side of the doorway, creating a frame that the door would seat into rather than simply closing against. When the door was closed, it would sit a half-inch deep into this frame, making it nearly impossible to pry open from outside. The top of the frame received special reinforcement, a heavy lintel log that would support the pulley system. Above this lintel log, Wilhelm installed the main beam for the pulleys. This beam was oak, 8 inches in diameter and 6 feet long. He mortised the ends into the corner logs and secured them with iron pins. The beam projected into the cabin interior by 2 feet, providing the anchor point for his pulley system. Everything was finally ready for the critical installation phase. Wilhelm mounted the first pulley disc on a cool morning in early August of 1841. He positioned it carefully under the main beam, 18 inches from the door frame. The iron axle pin went through the beam first, then through the center hole of the pulley disc, then back through the beam on the other side. Wilhelm secured the pin with iron washers and wedges that prevented it from sliding out. The disc hung freely under the beam, 2 inches of clearance, allowing it to spin without rubbing. He tested it with his hand. The disc rotated smoothly, the beeswax lubricant doing its job. The second pulley disc went up the same way, positioned 3 feet from the first disc along the beam. Now Wilhelm had 2 pulleys hanging under his main support beam, ready to redirect the forces he was about to apply. He stood back and examined his work. To anyone else it would look strange, these wooden wheels hanging under a beam above a door. But Wilhelm saw the beginning of a system that would change everything. The counterweight came next. Wilhelm had prepared a leather bag sewn from deer hide, strong and flexible. He filled it with river stones, testing the weight repeatedly until he had exactly 40 pounds. This weight had to be precise. Too light, and the door would not seal properly. Too heavy, and the door would be difficult to open. 40 pounds proved correct through trial and experimentation. He attached the bag to one end of his hemp rope using a knot he had learned on the Hamburg docks, a knot that would never slip under load. Threading the rope through the pulley system required careful attention to the path. Wilhelm started with the counterweight hanging inside his cabin near the back wall. The rope ran from the counterweight straight up to the first pulley disc. It passed through the groove in the disc's edge, redirecting from vertical to horizontal. The rope then ran across to the second pulley disc, passed through its groove, and redirected downward. The free end of the rope came down to where Wilhelm would attach it to the top of his door. Before making that final connection, Wilhelm installed the gear wheel on the door's exterior face. This wheel was smaller than the pulley discs, 10 inches in diameter, carved with 12 teeth around its edge. He had spent 3 days making it, shaping each tooth carefully so they were uniform. The gear wheel mounted to the door with an iron pin through its center, allowing it to rotate. Wilhelm wrapped a separate length of rope around this wheel, creating a mechanism he could use to adjust tension manually. Now came the moment of truth. Wilhelm attached the main rope from the second pulley to a reinforced point at the top of his door. He slowly released tension on the installation supports he had used to hold the door in position. The counterweight took the load. The door pressed firmly against its frame, held by constant inward tension from the pulley system. The first real test came in November of 1841, when an early winter storm swept through the northern Rockies with winds that reminded Wilhelm of the previous year's catastrophic blizzard. He sat inside his cabin listening to the wind howl, watching his door carefully. It did not flex, it did not rattle. The pulley system kept constant tension, and the door remained sealed perfectly against its frame. Snow piled against the exterior, but the door held without effort. When the storm passed after 2 days, Wilhelm opened his door easily by turning the gear wheel to release tension. The counterweight descended, the pressure released, and the door swung open smoothly, despite snow drifted waist-high against it. Marcus Teller's temporary door had failed again, not catastrophically this time, but enough that snow had entered and damaged supplies. When Marcus saw Wilhelm's door system functioning perfectly, his skepticism vanished. He asked Wilhelm to help him build the same system. They worked together through late November and into December, constructing pulleys, mounting beams, threading rope. By Christmas of 1841, Marcus had a door that would protect him through any storm. Word spread slowly through the scattered trapping community. Men who had survived door failures, or knew someone who had died when shelter failed, began paying attention. Wilhelm taught the technique to anyone willing to learn. By 1843, 11 cabins in the northern Rocky Mountain region had pulley door systems. The trappers called them sailor doors or Hamburg doors, and they reported that these doors survived storms that destroyed standard construction. During the brutal winter of 1843 to 1844, when temperatures stayed below zero for 6 straight weeks and multiple blizzards struck, the cabins with pulley doors kept their occupants alive, while traditional cabins failed repeatedly. But the era was ending. The fur trade collapsed in the mid-1840s as beaver populations crashed and fashion shifted away from felt hats. Trappers left the mountains in steady streams, heading to Oregon, California, or back to eastern settlements. Wilhelm left in 1846 with money saved from his trapping years. He settled in Oregon Territory, found work as a carpenter in Salem, and married a widow named Catherine Mueller in 1847. They had 3 children. Wilhelm never spoke much about his mountain years, and his family knew nothing of the door system that had saved lives. The cabins remained in the mountains, scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Some were discovered by settlers who recognized the superior construction and occupied them for years. Others slowly collapsed as weather and time took their toll. By the 1860s, most traces of the pulley door systems had vanished. Wilhelm Krauss died in 1868 at age 59, buried in a Salem cemetery with a simple stone that listed him as a carpenter. Nothing mentioned the mountains or the innovation he had developed. His greatest achievement had been carved in wood and rope, materials that rotted and frayed and left no permanent record, proving that the most important frontier innovations were not always remembered, just quietly used by people who needed them to survive.